Welcome back to the TrailBLAZER Pod. I'm your host, Faye, and each week I bring you stories of Jewish women who are trailblazers. This week's trailblazer is Chava Green. What happens when an academic, artist, and feminist, raised in a secular world, finds deep meaning in Judaism? In this episode, writer, scholar, and Hasidic woman will challenge everything you think you know about feminism, identity, and Orthodox Judaism. She opens up about embracing tradition without abandoning critical thought, and what it means to be a trailblazer in a world that often wants you to choose just one path. Let's dive in. So nice to meet you. Welcome to the TrailBLAZER Pod. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for joining me. So you have a really interesting story, and I'm excited to get into this. I did mention to you offline that I am 11th generation from the Baal Shem Tov. And for those who are listening and are not familiar, first of all, you'll learn a lot today. But the Baal Shem Tov is the founder of Chassidus.
Yeah.
And I'm very proud of that fact. And so this is personally going to be a fun conversation for me. So Chava, I like to start with all my guests by asking them about their childhood. And yours is particularly interesting. So I know you grew up secular, but I don't know much. Like, did Judaism play a role at all? Like, what was that like?
Yeah, it's interesting looking back now that I'm Orthodox and Hasidic. I look back and I see all the strands of kind of spiritual influences and ideas. But really growing up, no, religion played almost zero role in my life. Yeah, I was into sports and reading. I was very academic. I love poetry. Yeah, my mom's Jewish, and I grew up knowing that made me Jewish, but it was not an identity I really called myself. I would just say I'm not religious. Dad's family is actually Quaker Protestant, and my dad's mother was a Unitarian minister when she was young. Yeah, and she had a really big impact on me because she was a very spiritual person. And so I always had a sense of spirituality and that things are meant to be, and like an interest in religion as something that exists in the world. It's important, but it didn't have any necessary relevance for my day-to-day life.
Fascinating. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in New Jersey. I was actually born in Manhattan. My parents are very cultural, they're very into, that sort of art and culture and traveling. And so I was born in Manhattan, but when I was 8, we moved to a small town in New Jersey, and that's where I grew up.
Okay. Where are you now?
So now we live in Philadelphia.
Philadelphia. Yeah. Okay. So you were very into sports and you didn't really know much. You ended up going to college, which, makes sense. But I'm curious, why did you choose to study what you did? Like, where did that come from? I feel like not many women that young, like what you were 17, 18, are interested in the topics that you were interested at such a young age.
Yeah. I think I was always precocious as a child. So I was interested in deep things, and I would read, the books I was reading. I would read Ayn Rand and philosophical books. So by the time I got to college, I was definitely interested in the humanities, and I just had a general sense that I want to figure out how the world works and my place in it.
Yeah.
And so that first semester, I just took a bunch of different classes, and I took religion 101 and women's studies 101. And I guess I had a natural interest in these things. Like I said, I was interested a little bit in spirituality. I knew my family had this religious tradition maybe 2 generations before me. So I was kind of well, I didn't even get the chance to learn about it, And then women's studies, I think because I was always kind of had a balance of masculine and feminine traits, which everybody does. But I very much identified as being very scholarly and academic. And I felt like in my high school, more of the boys were into that. And I was also played sports. And when I was in elementary school, the boys were playing flag football on the playground, and they wouldn't let me join. And I was I'm so much better at sports than half the boys. I'm not as good as the best boy, but I'm much better than all the boys that are not athletic. So
that's so
I had a whole argument with the recess monitor, and he's yeah, I guess you could play. And so for me, that was kind of my first feminist moment.
I was just gonna say that sounds like the first feminist moment, foreshadowing to the rest of your life. Wow.
So I got really into feminism in college, and I think because I'm a very ideological person, when I feel there's a truth in something, I go all the way. And so that's kind of what happened there.
Yeah. I relate to a lot of what you're saying. It's really funny because I was also very into poetry. I actually started college. I started as a creative writing major. I think I was going to go into journalism or poetry or something. And then my first semester, I take a sociology 101, fell in love with it. But for me, it was because I did grow up in the Hasidic community. I was trying to understand what does that mean? Like the rest of the world looks so different. Like why, how does religion happen? How do communities happen? It was almost like this light bulb moment for me where it's like, oh, I can actually understand the meaning behind these societal norms that I almost took for granted for so long. So it's interesting because we came from it from different, from different perspectives, but kind of the same type of interest, like trying to understand, I guess, the truths of the world. So I find that really fascinating.
Yeah.
So you did mention in a previous, I stalked you. I listened to all the podcasts that you've done, and I do that a lot with my guests. But you did mention in a previous interview that while you were in college, you observed like a split in the women's studies department, and I think I want to talk to you a little bit about that. I want to understand what that was because you were mentioning that it really impacted you. So like, what was that split, and why? Like, why did it affect you?
Great question. So, in the women's studies department at the school I went to, there was the two guards of feminism, I would call them. There's like the old guard and the new. And and the old guard of feminism was this very, I felt like it was a very rich, poetic, spiritual feminism of the earlier waves of feminism. And it was so much about being a woman, like just basic, like,
Yeah.
changing the world to recognize the importance of women's experiences, women's voices, the unique way that women go through the world in our bodies with our experiences, and how the world is not set up for that. The world was set up for men. And this was
Right.
like, talking about light bulb moments. This was like huge for me because I realized I was always trying to fit myself into a
Yeah.
category in my life that was made for boys or for men.
Yeah.
And it always never felt 100%. I always felt like I was not completely harmonious within myself of the different pieces of myself. And when I realized, the famous line in feminism, the personal is political, I realized my own experiences were not in a vacuum. It actually was reflective of the structure of society being,
Wow.
patriarchal. And so that was the initial ideas of feminism that really spoke to me. And because I had that artistic, creative side, I loved the spirituality of it. And then, so I took some classes about contemplative feminisms and meditation and spiritual feminisms. And then my sophomore year, I took classes with the young women in the department who had learned about feminism from the 90s on. And that was really what feminism had become and what was accepted as feminist. And the feminism I was just describing had become part of feminist history. Like, yeah, we needed that as a stepping stone, but now we realized how wrong they were, how essentialist they were, how they confined women to their biological functions, and we've moved past that to a gender-free world where people can construct gender however they want. And so there was one semester I was really into that because it makes a lot of sense, and when you read the theory and you're deep in it, you see the progression of ideas and you see why that became the new brand of feminism. But I felt like there was so much lost, and I was like very stuck in between. And I'll give you an example of what that looked like in my life, my personal life.
Yeah.
So I was really involved with this women's center on campus. Most big schools have a women's center. It's like some liberal social justice environment where when we get together and talk about feminist stuff. So I was really involved with that.
Yeah.
And I remember after I had been involved for a while, we had a meeting of the leadership team for the women's center. And we were talking about how it's very exclusionary to call it a women's center, because it excludes people who don't identify as women, non-binary, men, all these things. And by the way, this was just the cusp of when this sort of kind of...
I was just thinking that.
This was like 10, 15 years ago. So this was not... Wow. Now all of that is taken for granted. When I was in college, this was just the flipping over that was just starting to happen. So they were discussing what should we call it? And I said, well, why don't we call it the womb? Because the womb is a place of growth, of nurturing, of creativity, of development. We're all born from our mother's womb. Like, it's
poet Chava.
Exactly. Like, let's reclaim the beauty of this like magical place of the womb. And like, I see everyone on the table looking at me like horrified.
Like, oh my god! Like, how dare you suggest?
Yeah, how dare you suggest that women are defined by their reproductive capabilities, and people who don't have wombs, this is horrible. And I was like so embarrassed and also really confused, because I felt like I had such a good reason for this, and like it was so deep, and like I didn't understand like women's creative ability to bring a new person into the world. I feel like should be so central to our feminist politics, and it was actually something like almost embarrassing to mention.
Oh my god.
I think complete confusion right now in the world.
Yeah.
And the Lubavitcher Rebbe, so I'll get into my experience coming to Chabad, but he, in a lot of his talks and his letters, he would say the issue at the world now is people call darkness light and light darkness. And I think it's a very deep psychological kind of approximation of what's going on. To take something that is foundational to elevating women's status and also creating kind of a understanding of women's identity that's holistic, that pulls in all the different parts of us, even if you don't end up having children. Like, this is a part of womanhood writ large, so
right.
And so denigrating that, I think, is this classic confusion that's happening right now.
So like when you were you left that meeting, what happened then? Like, did it only start to make sense to you when you did, find Chassidus, or was it something that you already, understood in your own terms beforehand?
I think I was coming to realize that I didn't fully align with the feminism I was seeing, but I did not think there was an alternative until I encountered Judaism.
Yeah. I love how like deep and you were at such a young age. Like, I feel like I relate a lot. I thought I was the only one going, like, having these questions at 18 and I looked around campus. I'm like, everyone's just living their life. Like, why are they not thinking about the things like heavy topics, right? And I was just so confused. Like, am I the only one experiencing this? And so I love hearing your story that, no, like, there's other people out there. I just think sometimes we're a little bit afraid to be open about that stuff at such a young age. I hope this podcast can, like, help young women with that. But so at 20, you lost your grandfather, right?
Yeah.
And you mentioned that it was like this existential crisis for you. Like, why did it have it's very sad. I also lost my grandparents at very, very young ages, but I'm curious, like, why did it have such a impact on your personal life?
So it's actually great you're asking this question in this juncture in our conversation, because if you think about, this was kind of what I was going through in my early years of college, feeling really excited and passionate about something, and then feeling like there was this dark backside of it, or like it wouldn't really create a stable path for me to walk on for the rest of my life. And like I use a lot of visual imagery when I think about kind of my journey, because it really was like walking on this path and testing each stone and being like, can I step on this, or is it gonna fall out from underneath
oh my god,
so that was something that I was thinking about. And my grandfather passed away. So, again, now having the words of Chassidus that I use, I understood that, there's this idea that when you want to go from one level to the next, in between, if you want to transform where you are going next, not just like a little bit better, but an actual new reality, there has to be a stage of disintegration in between. Just like the seed is planted, and if it's going to become a tree, it has to disintegrate first. So because I'm very intense and like, we're talking about being a deep thinker, it can be really hard to live with.
It's hard. It's dark often, right?
You feel like I'm alone and like I don't know what's going to happen next. And so I think that when my grandmother passed away, I went into a dark place of not knowing anything, like basic foundational things about myself, about the world. Who am I? What does it mean to be alive? I'm gonna die one day, so why am I alive? What's the point?
Yes.
What's the point?
Oh my god, I wish I knew you in college.
We would have been friends.
Yes.
And it's true though. I don't think I articulated this to people around me really, because it's scary, and like you don't want your parents to freak out and be like, "What's going on?"
100%.
So I wrote like poetry about it. I journaled about it, and I like basically was like. And when you're in that place, the whole point of why that place is so hard is because you don't know what's going to happen next. If you knew what was going to happen next, you would be like, okay, I'll make it, which is the benefit now of maturity. Like,
right. Yes.
But at that stage, when he passed away, I had a dream. I had a dream the night before that someone in my family died. And that, kind of spiritual experience, I don't think I had something like that happen to me before. So going into this existential crisis, that was my little beacon of light, of like, interesting. Like, I really feel like I have to think about being a soul, or like, and I remember asking my brother at that time period. I have one sibling, my younger brother, and we're close. We don't like necessarily talk all the time, but I remember at that time calling him, being like, where is grandpa's soul? Like, where did his soul go? You know, he's like,
Wow.
it's like, I don't think we have a soul. Like, what do you mean a soul? Like,
What's
we weren't
happening?
raised with that even word.
Yeah.
So like, you know,
Yeah.
so that I realized actually was kind of revelatory that I was even thinking about that.
Wow. Have you read the book, the Viktor Frankl book, The Man's Search for Meaning?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It came up because one time I actually was very lucky that like my parents did embrace me asking all these questions. I think sometimes as teenagers or young adults we're afraid to bring this up because we don't want people to think we're like chronically depressed or suicidal, because it's completely separate things, right? You can be questioning life and trying to figure it out without wanting to harm yourself. And I definitely didn't. I was just like, what is the deeper meaning of life? And so one day I texted my dad that in the gym. I remember it so vividly. And he's like, oh, Faye. And he sent me the book. He's like, just read this. And yeah, it was pretty amazing. And I did read it and it helped me for a little bit. I'm not going to say it helped me for good, but like for a couple of weeks after, I like it did help me. And then again, with maturity and with figuring out who you are, I think it falls into place naturally. Of course, I still have moments, but I think it's what you were saying. It's like the maturity that comes with it really helps. So I find that really interesting. A lot aligning there. But so you did mention that this led to this whole like spiritual thing, and I'm curious, is that what led you to seek out Judaism in a different way?
Yes and no. So
Okay.
my actual first experience with Judaism was because I just happened to sign up for a Hillel barbecue event.
Okay.
And like,
Yeah.
I had no interest in like Judaism per se.
Yeah.
And they said you could go to Israel for free on birthright. I was like, a free
Oh.
trip? That sounds great. So
Yeah.
there was no component of looking for answers in Judaism at all. You know, like God literally had to just kind of like move me around like a chess piece, because I wouldn't
Yes.
have thought like I
Yeah.
wouldn't have thought Judaism was spiritual, because growing up I only knew Reform Jews, and like there's no spirituality. It's very much like a community, you know, or like identity.
Right.
But when I was on that birthright trip, we went to Sfat, and of course,
Gorgeous.
you know, the birthplace of contemporary Kabbalah and
Yeah.
the artistry and just the poetics of it. Like we were there, and the day that we had gone, there was this mist that came over the mountain, and I was reading, and like, you know, I was reading about, I got an English Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and I just read it in English. It took me like a year.
I love it. I love it.
And I was reading about like the clouds of glory hovering over the tabernacle. And when we were in Sfat, I mean, this was before I had read that, but I had a sense I was like in a cloud. So that was an opening for me to think about Judaism as a spiritual option. And again, important books along my journey as well, like, you know, R.A. Kaplan's book Jewish Meditation I read, and I didn't necessarily do the meditation, I didn't understand the meditations, but I was like, there is Jewish meditation. There's cool. Something. There's some, you know. And then another book that was crucial for me was called The Jew and the Lotus, which is a fascinating book of a group of Jews that are invited by the Dalai Lama to go to Tibet, and because the Dalai Lama, his people were in exile, and he wanted to ask the Jews, how did you keep your tradition in your exile? And that book presented so many foundational ideas in Judaism through a very accessible lens.
That's amazing.
Yeah, not like complex, not in Hebrew, like very accessible.
Wow. Okay, something that I love about you is like you don't just take things for granted. Like the same goes for when you were trying to figure out feminism, and when you were like figuring out your journey with Judaism, you spoke to a Reconstructionist rabbi, a Reform rabbi, a conservative rabbi, and then the Chabad rabbi. What motivated you to like seek out all the different diverse perspectives in Judaism? I feel like a lot of stories I hear of people becoming more observant, they kind of just find like, you know, Hillel, and then that's where they end up, or they meet a conservative person and that's where they end up. I think it's pretty rare for somebody to go and basically try out the different versions to see what's actually like true to them.
Yeah. So I guess I was like always an academic in training. You know, now I have my PhD.
Yeah.
But at the time, like I always had this kind of idea of I'm gonna figure it out myself. I think it's a personality quirk, and like also, you know, probably like on the negative side, like a little sense of distrust. Like, you know.
Okay, that's fair. That's important.
Yeah, like kind of not. I wasn't necessarily raised. You know, they say this now, like, you know, one of the biggest challenges in education is like a lack of authority or like hierarchy. I think I was raised in that environment of not necessarily taking what older people said as true.
Got it. Okay.
Which I think has a bunch of disadvantages,
and advantages. It has
but
both.
Of course, that's what I'm saying. Like I think primarily it's advantages, like,
yes, agreed.
And so that was me doing my research, and
Got it. I love
but
it.
also because I came back from Birthright and I was just like, what's Judaism? I have no idea, and I will say one like nuance to this is that going on to Birthright, it was an Orthodox Union trip, an OU trip. And some of the people that I was involved with in the Women's Center, of course, are very liberal. And they were telling me, be wary of what they're going to say and don't just take what they say for granted. And so I kind of had my guard up a little bit.
Got it.
And so I had to kind of figure it out.
Yeah, like the classic stereotypes about religious. Yeah, for sure. So what like drew you to like Chassidus and Chabad?
So there was like many years in between that. Like, let's say I was 20 when I came back from Birthright, and I was probably 3 years later before I became Chabad. Okay. So in that process, a lot of things happen. I actually knew the Chabad rabbi on my campus, but the Chabad at my school was like modern Orthodox, actually. That's who went to it.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so I didn't really fit in with that crowd because I didn't come from that background. So I joined like a Litvish Kirov, like outreach group. So my Rebbitzin was actually not Chabad for a long time. And being in that world, they're like, we're Judaism, this is mainstream. And that's what I was exposed to. And so when I was in seminary in Israel, I started learning Breslov Chassidus, and I started going to like there's like this whole like hippie Hasidic like vibe in Israel, like in that cloud, and like kind of like the generations from Shlomo Carlebach, like there's like religious people that are like in that style, and I was super into it. But again, I was like, part of me was like fully on board with that, but part of me is like just kind of more in this world, like practical. And so I had a feeling I'm going to move back to America, and I can't really be Breslov. I can't really be like spiritual hippie, I also was thinking about dating, and I'm like, how am I going to meet somebody who's more grounded than me? Because I'm not always the most grounded. So like,
really? You sound... I like this because you have two sides to yourself, right? You have this like academic, philosophical part to you, and then you have the poet and the art and the... I think this is so fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I felt like that whole environment in Israel fed the poetic, artsy side of me, but not as much the intellectual, grounded side. Right. So when I came to Chabad, I felt like for me personally, I found my perfect balance, because Chabad has the mysticism, the kind of like fashion, the and like there's like a whole side in Chabad of like artists and stuff. Yes. But then what does Chabad stand for? The three intellectual faculties, Chachma, Bina, and Das. Wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. And so the reason it's called that is because Chabad has an intellectual path that really deeply delves into philosophical ideas. And that's the foundation of this sect in the Hasidic movement. And so when I came to Chabad, it was really a culmination of a lot of my journey. It didn't happen overnight, but
it never does.
Yeah, it never does. But that was for me what drew me most to Chabad.
I was gonna ask you what Chabad means to you and like what Chassidus means to you, but I think you answered the question. Maybe we can touch upon the Chassidus part in general. Yeah. My viewers come from all different backgrounds. Also my guests. Like I actually pride myself in that. I have guests from all different walks of life. So if you can explain what Chassidus is, and I think you're the perfect person to ask because you have the academic, you really have the understanding of it.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll give you like a brief historical overview and then what it philosophical. Okay, cool. So you mentioned the Baal Shem Tov as the founder of the Hasidic movement. And so, in the 1700s, I think he was even born in the 1600s. This was after Shabtai Tzvi was a false messiah, and there was major pogroms in Russia that had devastated the Jewish communities. And it says that the Jewish people were in a faint. They were like asleep almost because of this pain. And the Baal Shem Tov, his first name is Israel. Yisrael. And there's an idea when someone is asleep, you have to call their name to wake them up. If anyone's married and their spouse is like sleeping, you're like, you don't wake up and you're just like, my husband, I'm like, I'm on.
Yeah.
But the name speaks to something deep. And so when the Baal Shem Tov came on the scene, he called the Jewish people's name. He said, Israel, Israel, wake up. And so what he brought to the Jewish people was a love of the Jewish people and a love of Torah and a love of Hashem all being one thing. They're indivisible. Because there was previous communities where they love the Torah, but the poor people who don't know anything, okay, they're lesser than the Torah scholar. And then there's communities where like they pray and it's like very passionate, but what about learning? So like to have all three of these components combined. So what that did was that raised up the simple Jews who could just, daven and to pray and to sing and infuse Judaism with a lot of joy. And so after the Baal Shem Tov, he had his students, and then each generation, the Hasidic movement split into more and more courts, and each one had their Rebbe, their leader, and they each had different styles. Some of it, the style was more geographic, sometimes it was based off of ideologies. And then after the Holocaust, the Hasidic movement came to New York and to Israel. And there's little pockets in Amsterdam and Argentina and Australia, other places, but that's the main areas. And now you even have like the Bostoner Rebbe from Boston, because I think for me, so let's talk a little bit about the ideology of Chassidus, which is that it is the idea that Hashem is alive with us and in our lives at every moment. And so one of the powerful ideas of the Baal Shem Tov, I'll say two of them, but there's so many. One is the idea of Hashgacha Pratis, divine providence, which really means more like individual care, or like like God is in every single thing in the world at every single time at every single place, and that transforms your life when you live with that. I went shopping yesterday for Passover things, and I was in the car saying, Hashem, it's up to you if I find something or not. It's not just chance, it's not just luck, it's not if I go to enough stores, it's up to you. And like every little moment is crafted by God, the good and the bad. And then another idea for the Baal Shem Tov is that we bring our body, our animal soul, into our Judaism. For the Hasidic movement, there was a very aesthetic view of the body, which is that the body is the enemy of the soul. And if you want to live a life of the soul, you have to beat down the body. And the Baal Shem Tov says, no, the body supports the soul. And in fact, Hashem's essence is found more in your body than in your soul.
Which means we have to take care of it and all the stuff.
Take care of your body, And so the whole like fasting and, beating up, there was a move towards more joy, and I would say a more holistic view of the world.
Thank you so much. Like even growing up with it, you just put it so beautifully. I like this a lot. So in another interview, you mentioned, I'm going to quote you, okay? My mind battled my heart as I was drawn spiritually to the Orthodox community, though my feminist side held up a fight against it. And speaking to you, I can understand now what you were referring to, but how did Chabad specifically address that tension for you?
Great. So I would say I had 2 or 3 major issues in like kind of the mainstream non-Hasidic Jewish world that are different in Chabad. One is women's leadership, and the second is women's Torah study. And so in the non-Hasidic Orthodox world, they still hold by the legal opinion that women cannot learn Gemara, the Talmud, and that has a lot of repercussions in general in how women understand their relationship to Torah study and their own perhaps intellectual capabilities, or like kind of the perimeters of their Judaism. And so when I was becoming religious on my college campus, the women would have classes on relationships, and sometimes the guys would have those too, but like that was the focus. And then the college boys would have Talmud classes, and I'm thinking, I'm in higher level academic classes than them. Why can't I learn that? And so
it's like the same with the sport when you were a little girl.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same with football. So like I was like, that doesn't jive well with me. And I struggle with it because I was becoming interested in the spiritual part of Judaism, and I felt like even then I had a sense at some point I'm gonna have to give myself over to this, because I had a very smart older Baal Tshuva friend who had become religious, and I went to her house all the time for Shabbos, and at some point she said to me, you can't compartmentalize your life. And I really resonated with that, because I was living like one life in college and then one life being Orthodox, and I had a feeling when I graduate college, at some point I'm gonna have to give myself over to this 100%.
Yeah.
Or else I'm always going to feel an internal sense of discomfort. Yeah. So then I'm even reliving how difficult it was. Oh my gosh.
Oh my God.
So that was a really big issue for me, that, my intellect would not be taken seriously, and I would at some point have a limit on kind of my experience of Judaism. And then the second one was women's leadership, which is that I felt like there was a handful of, and it's interesting because I'm talking 10 years ago. Now with social media, I feel like so many more women have a platform, on all wherever they want to speak and to spread their light, and and I think that opened up a lot. But back then, a lot of the women that I met, I felt like there was a real limitation. And in the non-Hasidic world, a lot of rabbis would be like famous rabbis, and like you wouldn't even know who their wife was. Like she was just behind the scenes. So, it kind of rankled me a little bit. And then in Israel, in the Haredi world in Israel, the division between genders is just so much more exacting. And I guess along this path, I was always kind of thinking like, I can appreciate other people's choices, but I'm also, as a feminist, kind of always thinking like, what is the best society? Like, what does it look like to have the best balance of liberal values and,
so bigger picture,
picture. And so I felt like some communities, it's not replicable for people, for like a general population, And so that was kind of what was going on. The lack of like the mysticism, I think, can sometimes, so let me step back and make one point about Chassidus again, which is that when you have a philosophical path that gives you the most pure concept in its most abstract form, then it can trickle down and apply to like all different situations in different ways, and it can have nuance, because you understand when you bring it back to like the abstract, that's the truth. However, when you don't have that mystical path and like the most clear abstract version of truth, so sometimes when things are happening in different situations, they can be distorted a little bit. And so that sometimes I felt like the way people approach men and women in the non-Hasidic world, it didn't fully feel right to me. And then when I came to Chabad, I felt like I started to understand what is masculine and feminine, and I felt like, oh, now I'm getting to the real core of this.
Wow.
And so just to kind of finish off this idea is that the Lubavitcher Rebbe wrote a talk in 1990, basically saying that literally my point, which is if women are going to higher education in the world, then they need to have higher education in Judaism. And if we want them to feel passionate, it's human nature that you have to know the reasons behind things if you're going to be excited about doing it. And so that's why they need to learn where halacha comes from, the Shulchan Aruch, in like the texts of Judaism. So that was like super powerful.
Yeah.
And then
makes so much sense.
Yeah. And then about women's leadership, the idea in Chabad that we are all representatives of Hashem in the world, men, women, children, no matter where you are. It's very democratic. And so that I felt like empowers, and going back to how I see society, that empowers young girls to see themselves as leaders, so.
Yes, which is so important. What are some like common misconceptions about the relationship between feminism and Chassidus that like you aim to challenge? Like maybe stuff that you were told by your friends or stuff that people tell you now. I'm curious if you have any that are like, they keep coming up.
It's really hard sometimes when you're so deeply in something to like
yes
like years and try to think like some of the things now just seem so ridiculous to me that it's even hard to like.
I get that. That makes sense.
Or, like dressing modestly. Like now I'm just like, this is so a natural part of my life and makes so much sense to me that like to have misconceptions about it, it's hard to like go back and think about it, and like that women don't have a voice. I'm trying to even think like what those misconceptions are, like that you're gonna have a bunch of kids and not be able to do anything. Like anyone who has children knows it limits you in certain ways. Like it's not unique to Judaism. So I think that, I think that a lot of like the issues that people have with Orthodox Judaism and gender, when they start getting to know, Orthodox women, the questions fall away because they're not really founded,
It's really interesting because I have to admit myself, like when I have Orthodox women on here, I myself, coming from this community, my internal stereotypes are like broken away. I think like even though I grew up in that way, we all have these stereotypes about our own life and our own communities, right? And it's kind of like when you step away and you listen to people's stories that you're faced with kind of the reality. Are there any women or like figures that particularly inspire you or inspired you when you were first seeking this out?
So actually, I'll just start with the now, because last weekend, or 2 Shabbos ago,
Oh,
I was a speaker on a Shabbaton that my friend organizes. It's her organization. It's called Chava Learning Center, and
wow.
it's a program that increases the opportunities for young Chabad girls to learn Jewish texts at a higher level. And they had this chidon, which is like a test, and these girls in 10th, 11th, and 12th grade learned the entire first book of the Rambam's halachas, his
Wow.
legal rulings. They memorized it and took tests, and then they came on this weekend. And it was like 180 girls, and they're coming to this weekend to learn Torah. Like, to sit in groups and learn, like, the text. And it was so inspiring to me, because I'm like, these are the young women that are going to be leaders, that are going to raise inspired next generation. They, it was so inspiring. So my friend who runs this program, Hadassah Shem Tov, I've always been so inspired by her, because she grew up Chabad, and she always felt like the Rebbe said, going back to my talk, the Rebbe said women should be learning, but the institutions were very slow in implementing this. And so she took it in her own hands, and she created this organization, and it is flourishing and growing, and the girls are excited about it. And so for me, like, this is such an example of not like some sort of, illustrious Rebbitzin figure who's untouchable, but someone my age who saw a lack in the community, and because of her own connection to the Rebbe and to Chassidus, created something out of nothing. Like,
Love that.
I'm so in awe of her. So
that's amazing. I think like when you watch people notice a problem and do something with it, that's the most inspiring thing ever. Okay. I read one of your articles and you said, quote, "Here I am, a multifaceted woman." And it's so simple, but so complicated. And I love this phrase because, again, back to like labels and pushing against that, that's exactly what this is doing. And like personally, I really struggled with integrating my life, and it's interesting because you mentioned that like you felt at some point like eventually I'm gonna have to give it my all, and I am like master of compartmentalization, and I'm actually like actively trying to learn not to compartmentalize my life. Like I'm allowed to bring it all together. I'm all these different things. Like I used to be so afraid that if I am this and this, then one is not true. Does that make sense? Like I was worried, or I'm like, maybe this means I don't know who I am. But like I'm learning that they're all parts of me. Like all of us are like, my friend always tells me, she's like, you're an onion. Every time I talk to you, like I find out another thing about you. And I was at first very ashamed about that, and now I'm learning to embrace it. So I want to ask you, like, what advice would you give to me and others who are struggling with this like tension of integrating and being multifaceted and like coming to terms with something that should be so simple but something that's so hard?
Yeah, this is a really deep question, and I think
Sorry.
No, I love it.
Okay.
It's really complicated, and I think in the age of social media now, and also like in the business world, like entrepreneurs, it's like you have to have your message clear. Like you have to have like your identity,
Your
clear.
brand.
Your brand, exactly, has to be like clear. And if you go off brand, it's confused.
Yeah.
And I think and also because of the polarization in the world, a lot of times we feel like we have to fit into camps, like right or left or whatever. And then on our personal lives. So, yeah. And I think that, like, let's say for me in my life right now, like I have my academic side, I have my kind of public speaking, writing, and then my home life, and then my inner world. And it does kind of feel like I have to like wear different hats when I step into these different places. And so I'm kind of 2 minds on this. Like on the one hand, I feel like it can be helpful to kind of adjust our styles when we're in different places. And I think that's like a natural kind of psychological need, and I'm talking like an academic conference, I'm talking to my kids and like, but so like, that's almost like natural. But I think when it becomes difficult is when we are like on top of like our natural capabilities, we then like have the critical voice or the judgment voice that like is the critic.
So loud.
That's like, can I do that? What does that mean about my identity? Which one am I really? And I think you put it well. Like it causes you to doubt yourself or like be embarrassed. I wrote an article about this recently, also kind of just like the anxious. I struggle a lot with anxiety, and I don't necessarily come across like that. So people are like,
definitely not.
So people are like, what do you mean? Like, even a close friend of mine, whenever I say it, she's like, you're just not an anxious person. I'm like,
it's like, gee, thank you.
I know, which is why I'm so ashamed of like feeling anxious, because it's not me, and like, you know, but on the other hand, it is. And like,
right.
I'm holding all of these pieces. And something I've been working on lately, like a practical tool for myself, is to just in each situation try to figure out, how do I be more authentically me here in relation to the environment, so I'm not being the same everywhere, but I am bringing some sort of authenticity of who I am. And so, like, give some examples. Like with my kids, I read a lot of like parenting things, and so many of them just, I'm like, ugh, like I'm you know, I'm not gonna I'm not gonna have like a 10-minute conversation with my 1-year-old about why I'm getting his shoes on, like, you know, like certain things just don't resonate with me. So I'm just trying to like be in a situation and not have the critic voice. Instead, just be like, what feels right to do in this situation from my deeper self. And then in an academic world, you know, I have people telling me, if you want to succeed, you have to do XYZ. And sometimes I'm like, some of those don't feel right. So then I stop. I either talk it out with my husband or a friend or journal, and I try to find like, what do I really want here? So going back to that, like, we had this inner voice has been covered up with so many layers. And I think like, you know, you talked about trailblazers, like women who are following that inner voice. And like, if you're gonna, you know, to use that imagery of walking down your path in your life, if you're gonna feel confident walking down that path, you need to be your biggest supporter. And like, you need to have these voices of like, I'm good at this, I could do this, you know. And if you have faith, like, God is with me, this is what I was meant to do. And the reason we fit in like gaps like in the world is when we know why we're here and we know our talents. And like, overcoming this compartmentalization of like, in each place I kind of have to be different, or even within myself I have parts that I don't understand how they go together.
Right. Yes.
Like kind of like at some point just being like, oh, the world is complicated, I'm a complicated person. That makes more sense actually than like,
yes, exactly.
You know, like, God is infinitely complex. Like, there's like something
so
like billion types of insects. Like, why would God make a billion insects? Like, because he's infinitely complex. So of course we are. Like, how much more so are we?
It's like just coming to terms with, and sometimes there's no answer. Sometimes it is just, we are complex human beings, and like, stop trying to figure it out. It's important to try to understand ourselves, but not always is there. I had the same thing. My dad literally asked me last year, he's like, I'm trying to figure out how these things you do connect. Like, there has to be a common denominator. And I was thinking about it, I was like, the only common denominator is me. Like, I don't have an answer.
That's beautiful though. Because you can hold all the pieces.
I'm trying, I'm learning.
Yeah.
But I love that advice. That's very like, that's actionable advice actually, that I can take with me, and I'm sure other people can take with them. And I was going to ask you what being a trailblazer means to you. You kind of touched upon it right now, but do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, well, I also think, so it's interesting we're just talking about this, like the voice of the critic in us.
Yes.
And I think people who are trailblazers maybe even have that more because we are trying to do something big. Like, we're trying, you know, and you can kind of, it's really easy to think like, who am I the right person to do this? Or like, you know, who, even me, like, sometimes I think it's crazy. Like, I got a PhD, have like little kids, I'm building this life, I went on this crazy journey. And sometimes I think, okay, maybe I'm like burnt out. Like, I don't do more now, you know. But there's that inner, you know, there's like the critic, but there's also the, I don't know what to call her, like the confidence.
There's a little bit of imposter syndrome that I'm hearing, right?
Exactly.
Like, am I the right person for this?
Yeah, and I think like the reason why is because when you're blazing a new trail, like, it's not set out for you. My husband and I actually discussed this a lot because when we first got married, we were on shlichus, we were working as a Chabad rabbi in Rebbitzin, and then he had a job, he was in Kollel, we were doing things. And a few years ago, he's like, I'm starting my own business. And that was terrifying for me because
that's different.
Yeah, because my dad just like worked at the same company for 50 years, you know, like that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And he's like, I'm starting something new. And I had to really internally realize that that's scary for me, because I like kind of having the certain structure that you fit yourself in, and like you know what to expect. And creating your own path is like it's scary, and at each step you're creating the next step, and so that's what makes it so scary. But that's what makes it revolutionary. Like talking about the Baal Shem Tov, like he created each next step, and like, and I feel like especially being a Hasidic woman, like the idea that there's a forward path. Like this Judaism is not about going back anywhere. Right. This Judaism is about redeeming the world and creating a perfect world. And I can't let go. I can't ignore my piece in that puzzle. So that's what being a trailblazer is.
I love it. You're such a fascinating woman, and your journey is so incredible. And whether someone's life looks like yours or not, in terms of like being an Orthodox woman or not, I think all of us can take things from the journey you've been through. Mm-hmm. And because it's basically it's a human journey. It's a journey of identity. And me and you came from opposite backgrounds, and we share so much in common, right? And I love that. It's one of my favorite things when I connect with people. And I honestly just want to say thank you. Thank you for sharing your story. And I feel like I was talking to like a mentor, but also a friend. I feel like I wish I had you when I was in college, but I'm so glad I got to meet you now. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure meeting you too.
Thank you.